introductions to these things often savor of the Stockholm syndrome, so I'll keep this I'll keep this very brief. I'm joined today by Keith Walmsley, a long-standing member of the ACES, almost from its inception, and author most recently of the ABC Tour, an account of the South American visit to the United Kingdom in 1932. Perhaps we could begin by talking a bit about the origins of the book. Whence your interest in the tour?
Yes, well, thanks, Rodney. It's a subject that's fired my interest for quite some time because I always like to explore the little obscure nooks and crannies of cricket history and cricket statistics. And the awareness of the 1932 tour, I became aware of it several years ago, has always sort of lurked in the back of my mind as something that needs a bit more research because there were no other writings on it that I could find. No one wrote a tour book at the time. None of the tourists themselves wrote an autobiography that tells you very much about the tour. So I felt this was an area that needed a bit of exploration. Just out of pure personal curiosity, I decided to look into it for myself and see what I could come up with.
Very good. You mention in the book a quiz. Did that have anything to do with it?
Not specifically. I was a quizmaster for the Cricket Society for many years. The Cricket Society in London used to organise an annual quiz, and for some years I took part in that, not especially well, but I much preferred being able to ask the questions because then I had the answers in front of me and I could tease the people who were getting the answers wrong and things in a rather malicious way. No, it wasn't as bad as that. This one was a question that came up several years ago about which cricket team toured England for the first time in 1932, playing its first-class matches. Unfortunately, although I hoped that I'd be able to score points off the competitors by none of them knowing the answers, unfortunately one of them did. I'm pleased that at least the tour had found its way into the awareness of some of those who were taking part in the quiz. But no, it wasn't the quiz that fired my enthusiasm, it was the other way around, I think.
And I'm sure it'll come as a surprise to a good many of our viewers and or listeners that cricket is played at all in South America. Certainly surprising to some to learn that it was played as far back as 1932. Could you say a bit about the state or the quality of cricket in South America at the time?
Yes, obviously cricket had been played in Guyana, now Guyana, then British Guiana, going back well into the 19th century. But we're talking really here about the, if you like, the non-British Empire parts of South America. Specifically, ABC is Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, but it was played elsewhere in the continent as well. The reasons being largely that it was taken there by British expatriates who went over to the countries over there to gain economic advantage, to involve themselves in the development of those countries, be it in railways, in ranching, in mining, all sorts of operations that the British in those days got themselves involved in. They were mostly public school boys who went out there. They'd learned cricket at their school and they took cricket with them. By the late 19th century, the standard of cricket had developed to a pretty high level. Difficult to draw any comparisons because they weren't playing against any sides whose standard one can judge them against. There were intense programs of domestic cricket in the countries, particularly in Argentina. Argentina was the main focus of the cricket in the continent. Certainly by the late 19th century, teams were regarded as being good enough to encourage MCC to send out a touring party. The first MCC tour party to Argentina only went just before the First World War. It was a fairly strong all-amateur MCC side that went out there. The Argentinians didn't disgrace themselves. They didn't win overall. I think, if I remember rightly, I think they may have won one of the so-called test matches between MCC and Argentina. They held their own, certainly, and they maintained that standard after the First World War as well. In some cases, some of the players were beginning to show their age. I think the feeling is generally, looking at the history, that standard of cricket was probably its highest just before the 1932 tour, probably in the post-First World War period, perhaps just before the First World War, was when cricket was at its highest standard. An authority as high as Roland Bowen, in his history of cricket, suggested that at one time it was thought that South America collectively might have been able to put together a side of test match standard. They wouldn't have been able to play test matches because they weren't in the Empire, so they weren't in the ICC. That was the way in those days. But the standard itself was reckoned to be on a par with some of the, if I may call them that, lesser test match countries of the era. By 1932, I say, the standard had fallen a little. Some of the best players were getting a bit long in the tooth. There was one bowler who didn't come on the tour, but who would have been regarded as probably the best bowler in South America or in Argentina. He was 58 years old, and it was reckoned that was probably a bit too much for him. I think he would have been selected if he'd been willing to come, but he would have been found out, I suspect, over an 8-week tour as intense as this 1932 tour was. But the standard was still high, and they were holding their own against other touring teams. MCC and others were sending out touring sides, all amateur sides, not the strongest sides that could be put up against them. And indeed, I think at the time of the tour, it was suggested that the overall they might have been of the standard of one of the lesser first-class counties in England. So, they weren't a Yorkshire or a Surrey, but they might have been a Northamptonshire or a Leicestershire or a Glamorgan. For them to come over to test their abilities against English teams, and they went to Wales and Scotland as well, was a fair test of just how high their standard had reached.
All right, well, moving on to the tour itself, the ABC tour, I suppose we should begin by saying I don't think we have yet what ABC stood for, and then maybe a bit about when the tour was first bruited, who the prime movers were, the challenges faced in its organisation and inception.
Yes, well, the ABC tour was the nickname it was given in reflection of the fact that the tourists came from the three countries, Argentina, Brazil and Chile, probably in that order of priority, shall we say, in terms of their strength in their playing strength overall. The tour itself was first suggested early in 1930. At that time, Sir Julian Kahn, who was a great benefactor and sponsor of cricket at home and abroad, he was making a tour of Argentina particularly, with a team of his own. On that tour, he took the opportunity to have a word with cricketing authorities in Argentina and Brazil. I'm not sure whether Chile were involved or not. I haven't found any reference to suggest they were, about the possibility of a team being put together to come to England either in 1931 or 32. From that little acorn, a great big oak grew. I think the idea of coming in 1931, which is the season following the Kahn tour to South America, that was quickly knocked on the head for just logistical reasons. But 1932 was quickly settled on as being a good year to come, not least, I suspect, because as well as being soon, not unnecessary delay, it was also a year when there was no major tourist, Australia specifically, coming to England. But it was in fact the year in which the first all-India test tour was made. The first time that Indians played test matches was in the 1932 season. So they'd be sharing the tour with the Indians, they knew that. But nevertheless, it was a time perhaps when they would be able to get a fair degree of publicity for their activities. They wouldn't be squeezed out by all the interest that Australians would have, for example, if they were over here. So the three cricket authorities of the three countries got together to select their teams for the tour. Now, the problem quickly arose that this was not a good time, in fact, economically, for anyone to be doing anything very much. The Great Depression of October 1929 came just before the public announcement that a tour would be made. It wasn't too early then to say what the effects of that depression might be. But by the time they got around to selecting teams in 1931, late 31, early 32, the depression was biting very hard. And a lot of the British people out in South America who might well have been candidates for selection for the tour declared themselves not to be available for economic reasons. They really needed to be at home looking after the shop, as it were, rather than spending what amounted to the best part of 3 months, including travel, on a jolly playing cricket. So several of the better players, including a 58-year-old bowler who was probably the best bowler in South America at the time, were not able to make the tour or declined to make the tour. Some of the better batsmen as well, and in particular, some of the best of the Brazilian batsmen were not able to make the tour. So various names were mentioned, but a number of those were dropping out as time went on. So the result was that by the time they actually got on the boat to come over here, the side consisted of many of the very best players, those the automatic selections, but also some who were not automatic selections. They were, if you like, the best of the rest. And again, I don't cast any aspersions by using a phrase like that. So it made it not a fully representative side from the three countries. It wasn't quite as strong as the side that they were hoping to bring. The fixture list that had been drawn up in the meantime was probably drawn up with the expectation that they'd be bringing a slightly stronger side than they did. But it was still a challenging tour. It would have been a challenging tour even for the very best of the side. But in practice, some of the players were not so ready, if you like, for international experience. They played for their individual countries, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, but not for a tour of this sort of length. At least they weren't first choices for it.
And now a bit about the composition of the team. You've somewhat alluded to and answered this, but how strong and how representative was it in the end? By representative, of course, I mean both of the quality of cricket in those three countries and of their ethnic composition.
Of the 15 playing tourists who came, 10 were from Argentina, 3 were from Brazil, 2 were from Chile. The original expectation was that it would be 4 from Brazil, 1 from Chile, but it ended up as 10-3-2. That probably was a fair reflection of the relative standards of the three countries. Argentina was probably the strongest, though not necessarily to the extent of 10-3-2. They were stronger than the other two sides, but they wouldn't always beat them. As far as the ethnic composition is concerned, the whole side was made up of people who were of English descent. Many of them were born in Argentina or Brazil or Chile. Others were born in the UK but travelled out to Argentina to seek their fortunes. Cricket in Argentina was not in any way segregated or racial in its get-together. Many of the club sides included non-Anglos, if I can call them that, though mostly they were of African descent rather than of Latin American descent. There were few genuine Spanish names in the scorecards in that period. I think it's fair, though, to say that for whatever reason, the best cricketers in those countries at the time were the Anglos. There weren't any Latin Americans or Africans or anyone else who was beating on the door to be let into this tour. But the cricket itself was not racially divided in any way. Having said that, this was an era, no doubt, when some clubs, and I can't point the fingers, I'm not accusing anybody, but some clubs might have had a slightly looking down on some of their applicants. But on the other hand, there were other clubs that were only too willing, I think, to take members of all backgrounds. But there's no suggestion that there was a racist selection involved. It was purely selecting the best, and the best were at the time of British ancestry.
And did you encounter any particularly interesting characters as you made your way down that squad list?
Well, this is where it gets interesting and yet disappointing in a way. There was only one name in the 15 that might have been familiar to cricket lovers in Britain, and that was the captain, who was Clem Gibson. He was Argentinian born. He died in Argentina. His father was a very big noise in the British community in Argentina. He played at Eton and at Cambridge University. When he was at Eton, which was during the First World War, he was one of the 5 bowlers of the year, schoolboy bowlers of the year, identified by Wisden, and he certainly made his mark at Cambridge. And in 1921, when he was still over here, played memorably when AC McLaren put a team together at the end of the season that managed to beat the touring Australians, who up to that point had been literally invincible. McLaren thought, I can put a team together to beat this lot, and he duly did. And it was Gibson who had a major part in that. He took 6 wickets in the Australians' second innings, bowling them out to secure that famous victory. So Gibson's name was known, even though he'd played most of his cricket in the meantime. After 21, he'd played most of that cricket in Argentina. He had a season in Sussex for 1926. He was actually selected briefly to go on the Ashes tour of 1924-25 to Australia. That was a McLaren-influenced decision as well, but I think he decided that he would be better off at home in Argentina looking after the business. When it was first announced, that wasn't a very universally accepted selection for the tour. He hadn't done anything immediately to justify it. Mind you, Sidney Barnes was in the same way. When he was first selected to go to Australia, he was an unknown as well at that level. Otherwise, though, the tourists were, dare I say it, a fairly bland bunch. Again, in cricketing terms, they were some very outstanding players, guys who'd scored a century in each innings for, I think it was Brazil against Chile, one of the players had. He was good enough to do that. The most interesting ones, I guess, were 2 of the Argentinian contingent, who were Dennett and Cyril Ayling, Ayling, a name that's propped up in county cricket from time to time. They were 2 of 5 brothers who were outstanding in domestic cricket in Argentina at the time. 4 of those 5 might have been worth a place in the side. The 5th one would have been too young for consideration, but all 5 played for Argentina in due course. Dennett was mainly a left-arm bowler, but also a good batsman. They were all all-rounders, really. And Cyril was a batting all-rounder. No, probably a bowling all-rounder just. Their younger brother, Cecil, I get very confused between Cecil and Cyril, but I think I've got this right this time. The younger brother, Cecil, was only 19 at the time. He wasn't selected as an all-rounder. He was probably the best of the lot. It's very difficult, though, to judge the ability of these players, again, because they'd never played against better standard opposition, but they were definitely top of the averages all the time within Argentina, and they were the best that Argentina had to offer. 4th ailing brother, who might have got selection, was John, who was a wicketkeeper, and I think wicketkeeper was a difficult choice for the selectors, but again, perhaps they felt that they'd selected 2 ailings and that was enough. They were good players who, I think, if more information about them was available, a good biography could be written about the Ayling family. Eric Ayling, who was the youngest, the one who was never in contention for this tour, did write a sort of a family history, which could form the basis of a biography. It needs more research, really, to be able to get better information, fuller information about their lives inside and outside cricket. They were certainly interesting characters. As far as the rest of the tourists, none of them really made much of a mark, and without wanting to preempt discussion of the tour tour itself, the tourists as selected tended to be much stronger on batting than on bowling. There was only 2 specialist bowlers probably in the whole squad, Clem Gibson, who I mentioned, and a left-arm bowler from Brazil called Ronald Pryor. There were a lot of all-rounders, though, but they all seemed to be, certainly in the way they performed in England, with the honourable exception of Dennett Ayling, they all seemed to be batting all-rounders. Their bowling wasn't so strong, certainly in England, which isn't to say they didn't take the odd wicket, but they never showed any danger of running through a side. The consistency was a problem in the batting too. The batsmen were all had good figures, they all had good records in the past, they were all capable of making a decent score, and they all did make a decent score, but they couldn't string decent scores together or have 3 or 4 of them making decent scores in both innings of the same match. This was probably not unconnected with the fact that at home in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, they were used to playing only one-day games once a week. They just simply were not used to playing 2-day and 3-day games non-stop from, as it turned out, late May to mid-July. It was a long, arduous tour for them. One suspects that was part of the reason why there were not a level of consistency amongst the players that either made them catch the eye or that meant the side could be any more successful than it was. Not to say that it wasn't successful, because it was, but it didn't have big names that really caught the public eye.
The tour itself, it's left nary a ripple on the great pond of history, has it? Yours is the first book in it, I think almost the first retrospective of any kind. It's certainly not a staple of cricket's folk memory. Would you say a bit about the reasons it's been so largely forgotten?
Well, I think probably, it was a unique tour, and that means it ought to be remembered in its way. And certainly I think it's a reason why it's a tour that's worth writing up. It was also not the highest standard of tour. In the end, it was subsumed by the Indian tour. The Indian tour got much more notice. Indians played a test match. They did have some successful and well-known players in their squad. It was a terrible summer to come to England anyway. The weather was atrocious for much of the time. Really, it got more forgotten as the tour went on. It started with high enthusiasm in the press. You'd find press reports in the major national newspapers of several hundred words of their pre-tour warm-up games against London clubs. By the end, you were lucky to get a report at all, even of 3 lines in those same newspapers. Just interest waned when it realised that players weren't catching the public imagination, which is a shame. And so even during 1932, the tour was drifting away from public memory. It got noted in Wisden, of course, and in contemporary cricket magazines. But because of the economic situation, it wasn't the first tour from Argentina of several, from South America, of several such tours. It was a one and only tour. Conditions got worse rather than better for cricketers in Argentina in the 1930s. There was no question of them coming over here again. The tour was played against not the strongest sides. They'd drawn up a sensible fixture list, if you like, not to be so threatening as to mean the side would inevitably be beaten every time it took the field. That didn't happen. But it didn't capture the public imagination. As I say, nobody thought fit at the time to write up an account of the tour. Just gradually it got forgotten, and the South Americans themselves, the standard of cricket there fell away over time, even over time in the immediate years after 1932. And there was no incentive for the tour to be repeated, and it just got quietly left to history to fade away until it gets picked up by a silly researcher in England 90 years on who thinks this is a tour that needs a bit more notice than that.
Yeah, well, my next question was going to be, so how'd the tour go? But we've rather covered that ground, haven't we?
Well, yes, so they played 19 matches in total on the tour, 6 of which were later granted first-class status by MCC in a formal decision, so the games were definitely unequivocally first class. Of those 6 games, they won 2. They beat Oxford University, who were a strongish side at the time, even though they were missing a couple of their better players for this game, not because they were rested, but because they were busy doing exams, as even at Oxford University cricketers had to do from time to time. But they beat them, and they beat an 11 put together by Sir Julian Kahn, a very strong 11. He put together some strong sides, usually amateurs with 1 or 2 professionals in them. And this was a really very famous victory. It was a 3-day game played at Sir Julian's own ground in Nottingham. On the first day, Sir Julian's side scored over 400, and one batsman scored 250. Dennis Morkel, the South African Test cricketer, scored 251 on that first day. And yet, over the 3 days, the South Americans managed to beat them by scoring, I think it was, I've got the scorecard in front of me here, so I'll can get the facts right, here we are. They, having bowled them out for 413 on the first day, the South Americans scored 338 themselves, then bowled them out the second time round for only 150, with all 10 wickets shared between the two brothers, Dennett and Cyril Ayling, setting themselves 227 to win in the fourth innings of the match, and they duly got them for 5 wickets down. And that was a very commendable victory against a strong side that obviously was no mean cricketing 11. Other county games they played had very variable results. So they played Leicestershire and were horribly beaten, embarrassingly almost. But later in the season, they played Sussex, who had finished, I think it was 3rd or 4th in the county championship the previous year, on paper by far the strongest side that they were due to meet. And they held them to an honourable draw, which is all you could hope for, frankly, against a side like that. If they'd beaten them, it would have been something very, very special. They lost to the Army in a unexpected result, if you like. They showed a lack of consistency between the first part of the game and the second part of the game. They fell away and lost that game. And Scotland was right at the end of the tour, and I suspect that the ardours of the tour were beginning to show, and they went up to Edinburgh, had a nice time as tourists, but the cricket was not of the highest standard, unfortunately. All their other games were drawn because either of weather or because that was the way it was with those games. There wasn't simply enough time to finish them. They had an honourable draw with MCC at Lords, side put together by Pelham Warner. I think they generally enjoyed the tour. They had a very, very busy schedule, but it was interrupted by various social events, dinners, lunches, you name it. But they also went to the Derby and probably lost a bit of money when the favourite didn't come home. But they also went to a day out at an airfield and had flights around the airfield, which was probably quite a novelty in those days. It was an arduous tour, but it had its lighter moments. But one mustn't think that those lighter moments in any way detracted from the seriousness with which the cricket was played. They certainly gave of their best on the day every time throughout the tour, and they covered themselves with a degree of glory, as I say, in their 2 first-class victories.
Very good. What else do I have here?
I haven't mentioned the weather, which was an important factor in acclimatising them.
Okay, maybe hold forth a bit on the weather.
Okay, well, the tour, I say the results weren't quite as good as they might have hoped for, but they weren't bad at all. But I'm sure the team was handicapped by the fact that just after they arrived, within a few days of their arrival, and it had already been a very wet May in 1932, late in May, the whole country of UK was hit by storms that were really seriously regarded as the worst to hit the country for 50, 60 years. It made pitches unplayable. It meant one of their scheduled games, which almost certainly would have been first class against Worcestershire, was cancelled altogether because there was simply no pitch available that could be prepared for a 3-day game. As Worcester sometimes gets, it was just completely underwater. Worcester usually gets underwater because of floods from the River Severn, but this wasn't that. This was just floods from the heavens coming down and waterlogging the whole ground. So that really upset their early tour preparations. They had a number of first-class match fixtures lined up against London club sides and so on, which would have been a good test for them, but a good acclimatisation as well. A good chance to get used to playing on turf wickets. Some of them were more used to Matic, and playing day after day after day rather than just having one day at a time. But that got thwarted by the weather early in May. It wasn't a great warm summer even after that, but it did mean that the team never really got acclimatised, and they were thrown straight into that game against Leicestershire, which was their first-class match, and which I say they didn't perform terribly auspiciously in. But that was probably not helped by the preparation that they had, or rather hadn't had. They were an unlucky side in all sorts of ways. They were unlucky by the weather. They were unlucky by the fact that many of the players who might have come were not available for economic reasons. They were unlucky by the fact that neither the press nor the public found them a side of sufficient interest to draw crowds in large numbers. Repeatedly you find in reading of match reports that the team was worth having much bigger crowds to watch them than they got, but crowds were often regarded, unfortunately, as disappointing or not quite what was expected. They never really quite captured the public imagination, which is, as I say, very disappointing for them. Obviously, playing in empty grounds wouldn't encourage them to give of their best every single second of the time. There wasn't quite the same pressure to perform like that. At no stage did they let themselves down.
Now, the challenges of this tour weren't limited to the playing of it. I'm sure researching it was a very major challenge. As we've said, very few secondary sources available, and even in the age of digitization, scouring Brazilian, Chilean, and Argentinian newspapers, I imagine, was something of a challenge.
Yes, certainly. I mean, my main sources, as you indicate, had to be contemporary press reports. The British newspapers covered the matches, as I indicated, in declining quantity. 700 words on the first day of the first match, 50 words if you were lucky on the last day of the last match. But fortunately, the English language newspapers in Argentina and Chile are available, and they're available to be seen at the British Library in London. And they covered the preparations for the tour, particularly the Argentinian papers, and the build-up to it, as well as the matches, and indeed, to an extent, the aftermath, though there wasn't very much about the aftermath. So that was where I had to get most of my information about the build-up, about the selection, about who was selected, who wasn't selected, and why some people weren't selected. But that did mean spending a lot of time just poring over newspapers, daily newspapers, to pick up the odd sentence here and there. I suppose it was a way of passing the time when the libraries were open during the pandemic. When the libraries were closed, obviously there was no access at all, but when they were open, I was able to get there and do a lot of research there. The problem is, I say, Argentinian papers, yep, plenty of those. Chilean papers, there's a weekly paper that was useful. But I could not find, and I've not been able to find, any English language sources from Brazil. I think those would have given a different perspective on the tour, both about the reasons why Brazilian players were not selected at the start. And there were some suggestions in the Argentine newspapers that the selection problems with over getting the right Brazilian players did cause a bit of friction between Argentina and Brazil, whether that was just between cricket lovers, if you like, in Argentina and Brazil, or between the cricket associations of those countries is not clear. I've no idea on. And if anyone could find me a source of English language newspapers from Brazil for the 1931-32 period, I would love to delve back into them and find out more. I did have a look. I don't speak Portuguese or Spanish, but I did have a look at the online versions of a couple of Portuguese newspapers from that period, Portuguese language newspapers from Brazil. And I did a search on the word cricket in various spellings and found precious little. It was there was a little bit, but nothing useful for this project, unfortunately. I had access to people who could have translated if necessary, but that was not required because there simply wasn't anything. And that's a big gap, unfortunately, in the research, as I acknowledge it in the book. And I would love to be able to get that extra perspective. But at the moment, the book has to be written largely from an Argentine and Chilean perspective.
Well, apparently there's a Labour government coming to power in Brazil, one a bit more interested than the current one in preserving its national heritage. So here's hoping.
Here's hoping. I mean, if the ACS who published the book would sponsor me for a few flights out to Rio or Brasilia or somewhere to go and look at the archives out there, I'd be delighted to go. But I don't think that's going to happen, unfortunately.
All right, well, perhaps you'd like to tell our viewers and listeners where they could get the book and maybe hold it up to the screen so they can have a good look at it.
There you go. That's what the book looks like. I hope it's catching the eye. It's certainly designed to have an eye-catching cover, simply called the ABC Tour. It's the first of a new series that the ACS has done on cricket tours, or is doing, I should say, on cricket tours that haven't been very well written up elsewhere, or else about which there is something new to be said. So there's another one coming out early next year on the MCC tour to India and South Asia in 1926-27, which hasn't had the same degree of coverage as some of the other tours to India. So it's an ACS publication. It can be bought from the ACS website, the address of which I think is acscricket.com, and then just follow through publications, and that will take you to pages on which you can order it online. It's only available at the moment as hard copy, and dare I say it, the current UK price is £16 for a book of 205 pages, but it's got all the scorecards, player biographies, as well as match-by-match reports and details of the arrangements for the tour and the arrangements after it. It's the first time really this tour has ever been addressed in print to any extent at all. But that's not to say that it's necessarily the last word on the subject, because there's that one big gap in Brazil. But there are still copies of it available, I know, from the ACS. And we'd be delighted, I'm sure, if more people were interested in buying the book, reading about the tour, getting to know the players involved, because there were there weren't much in the way of characters, but they had good cricket backgrounds, which are worth getting to know. And maybe others might be inspired to follow up some of the missing gaps.
Well, it certainly carries a hearty endorsement from your humble servant. In conclusion, what's next for Keith Walmsley? Do you have anything else in the pipeline?
At the moment, not as a book, anyway, as a printed book. I'm doing a lot of work for the ACS in editing other people's books, which is it's a quite enjoyable task, really. It's not a major task either. We've got some forthcoming books next year that I'm involved in. I'm also involved in a project that's ongoing forever, that started 3 years ago, called Major Feats in Minor Cricket, which is an attempt to gather together scorecards, or at least as much information as we can, about matches. There'll be usually club matches or school matches or junior matches, whatever, in which some major cricketing feat was achieved. A wicketkeeper made 7 stumpings in an innings, or a batsman scored 400, or a partnership of huge magnitude, of 200 partnership for the last wicket, all sorts of obscure things like that. The early fruits of that project is online at the acscricket.com website. And I'm continuing to do work on that at the moment, trips to libraries around the country in the UK to try and look at old newspapers that might just have the scorecards. They usually don't, but when I do find one, it's a moment of great triumph and personal satisfaction. And I'm hoping that by the end of this year, we'll have a new edition of that online. It's too big to be printable, to be publishable as a printed book, but the scorecards are there online, and that's what's occupying my time mostly at the moment, to just keep myself out of mischief.
One more thing before we go. Since this is the first in a series of interviews I'm doing almost under the ACS's auspices, it might be worth plugging the ACS. How do people join? And what is the ACS?
The ACS, the Association of Cricket Statisticians and Historians. We don't include the H in our short title, but we are very much statisticians and historians. It's open to everybody all around the world. Membership is available at range of rates depending on where you live and what format the membership consists of. It really attracts anyone who is interested in the statistics or the history of cricket in a modest way, if you like. No one is obliged to do any work, if you like, once you've joined the ACS. We welcome people writing articles, writing books, whatever, wanting to join the committee or whatever it might be. We're run by a small committee of 12, including yourself, Rodney, and others from Australia as well as from the UK. So we're a global organisation, but based in the UK. And membership is available, as I say, if you go to the acscricket.com website, that will explain how you become a member and what you get for it. The main tangible output is you get a free quarterly magazine called The Cricket Statistician, which has a series of articles. Some are historical, some are statistical, many are combine the two, and that's an important aspect. We don't have two factions, if you like, of stats on one side, historians on the other. Very much not. It's a melding of the two. And you also get, if you're a member, you get advised of future publications and that sort of thing, and the opportunity to save some money on some of them. So it's an organisation that does a lot of research into some obscure, some less obscure areas of cricket history and statistics. A lot of that material is published online, and the acscricket.com website is a very good place to have a look at the sort of things we've done in the past. The research section of that is probably the most useful in that regard. But the whole website itself explains more about what the association does. It's coming up on its 50th anniversary next year. It's been going since 1973, and so we're a venerable establishment now. We're not some Johnny's come lately, and we include amongst our membership, I can do some name dropping, a number of the best known of the cricket statisticians and historians around the world, certainly in this country. People like Andy Zaltzman, who does the stats for Test Match Special for UK radio and is also a stand-up comedian. It includes Andrew Sampson, whose name may well be known to a wider audience, who's a South African statistician based in this country nowadays. Also has worked for Test Match Special, written for various magazines. On the historian side, we have people like Eric Midwinter, who's a great writer of history, again, from a slightly, sometimes from a straight social history angle, sometimes slightly more wacky angle that would appeal to people like me who go for the wacky stuff. You've written a book about clown cricket, which was a venture in Victorian England late in the 19th century that hadn't been written up properly and researched before. So we have some distinguished names in our membership. We welcome new members from anywhere in the world. We are exploring ways of making membership more accessible to a greater number of people, and hopefully anyone who's interested will take a look at our website and look to make themselves known to us.
Very good, thank you. I think that was brilliant. Links to the website will be available in the description of this episode, so anyone wanting to join or merely to explore can do so very easily that way. Thanks a lot, Keith.
Thank you, Rodney.